they determined that this was indeed the Attorney General who was on this tape. Of course, a few months later, President Yeltsin promotes Mr. Putin and makes him prime minister. And on New Year's Eve in 1999, he actually announces that he will step down, and Mr. Putin will become the acting president. And in 2000, when the presidential election is held, now with President Putin, he wins in a landslide, and Igor Skuratov, who had to step down as Attorney General as a result of the scandal, gets less than 1% of the vote and is no longer a threat to take on the presidency. So the next influence operation that was executed also very successfully was actually a number of operations that were conducted throughout 2000s to try to delegitimize opponents of the current Russian government. A number of Democratic leaders were caught on sex tapes with a woman named Katya, who was, again, another lady of the night, and were caught in compromising positions. Some of these people were married. The goal was to try to expose them as immoral characters to try to weaken their position within the opposition movement to Mr. Putin. In 2014, we had a very interesting case, this time outside of Russia, where a GRU colonel, Colonel Ilyushin, was caught in France, and he was exposed as a Russian intelligence operative who was collecting a variety of intelligence materials. But one of the most interesting materials that he was focused on collecting was not necessarily French state secrets, although he was interested in that as well, but personal compromising information on President Hollande, and the fact that President Hollande was having affairs, and this type of information obviously would have been extremely useful to the Russians to try to blackmail the French president or to try to discredit him publicly. In 2014, and we'll go through this in much greater detail, you had some very interesting situations where a group named Cyber Berkut was launched right before the Crimean takeover by Russia, and that group has been involved in a number of disinformation campaigns that have been very supportive of the Russian goals that they've been trying to achieve in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. We'll talk more about that in a second. And in 2016, you had a campaign in Germany to try to discredit the Angela Merkel's government, the so-called, actually, Lisa affair. And there's a typo on the slide here. But Lisa was a girl, a Russian immigrant to Germany, who went to the police station in early 2016 and filed a report that she had been brutally raped by migrants. And that news story was picked up by Russian media in Germany and immediately triggered huge protests among the Russian community. The Russian government formally protested to the German government and raised the questions about their immigration policy of letting in all those migrants into Germany. And in the end, that whole affair actually proved out to be fake, and real questions have been raised about the connections of Russian intelligence agencies in promoting that fake story. So let's go now to Ukraine. The case in Ukraine actually presents a really useful set of evidence of how Russians have successfully manipulated elections even before the 2016 election in the United States. So it all began with party leaks. Sounds familiar, of course, but this time it was the party started by Klitschko, the famous boxer turned politician in Ukraine, one of the opposition figures in Russia. And the goal was really to try to discredit him. So his party email servers were hacked, and information and emails from that hack have been released publicly in order to try to connect him to communications with U.S. government and the Department of State and make him look in the eyes of a Ukrainian like an agent of the United States in order to try to discredit him in the upcoming presidential and later parliamentarian elections that were held in Ukraine that year. So in May, you had the presidential election in Ukraine, and the Russians actually executed a variety of influence operations against that election. So the Cyber Berkut group that we mentioned before launched denial of service attacks against the Ukrainian election websites. There was actually an infiltration operation into the Ukraine Election Commission, the commission that's responsible for the vote tallies, and a destructive attack was launched against their network to try to impede the vote tallying. And in the most fascinating case of all, they attempted but ultimately failed to replace the vote tally that would be displayed on the website of the Ukrainian Election Commission. But even though that website was never modified by the hackers, the main Russian television station, Channel 1 in Russia, showed in their broadcast of their election results this screenshot. This is taken directly from the broadcast, purporting to be from the website of the Ukrainian Election Commission, except this data was never actually shown on the Ukrainian Election Commission. But as you can see here, instead of Mr. Poroshenko winning, the ultimate president, it shows Dmitry Yarosh, who is a known neo-Nazi and right-wing figure in Ukraine, showing him winning with a large percentage of the vote. And at the time, and still now, the narrative in the Russian press has always been that the takeover of the government in Kiev in 2014 was a coup perpetrated by fascists and neo-Nazis, and showing that Mr. Yarosh is leading the polls certainly helped to promote this narrative. So a remarkable case of the main Russian news channel showing a purported website of the Ukrainian Election Commission and showing incorrect results that were never actually shown on the website of the Ukrainian Election Commission. And then in October, you had a parliamentary election in Ukraine, and very similar types of influence operations were executed there yet again. There were hacks and DDoS attacks that were launched again, DDoS attacks against Ukrainian Election Commission website. And this time, the Cyber Baku group was able to actually hack into election billboards in Kiev and change the information on the candidates that were using those billboards in order to put them, present them in a bad light. So with that quick overview, let's jump into some of the actual cyber operations that we have seen from these groups that we call bears, a variety of different Russian groups that are operating out of Russia with the support of the Russian government. And let me turn it over to Adam Myers to talk about CrowdStrike Intelligence and those groups.
Thanks, Dmitry. Interesting overview of where the history of the Russian intelligence services kind of came from. So what we're going to talk about now is how this applies to the information security domain. And let me first kind of just give a little bit of background about CrowdStrike Intelligence and what we do and why we do it. At CrowdStrike, intelligence powers everything that we do. We have an endpoint technology, we have intelligence subscription service, and we have incident responders that, very much like in the DNC case, will go out, conduct an investigation, perform analysis, and all of this is powered by intelligence in terms of being able to make sure that the technology is able to find interesting and unique attacks, that the services teams can go out and find threat actors before they hit the ground. They know what they're looking for and what types of things to look for. And all of this is predicated on the fact that we really think about who the threat actor is. And the rest of this presentation is going to be talking about, who are these threat actors, what motivates them, and how do these things really tie together. It's a lot simpler story, I think, than many would believe, and we'll walk through that. So from a perspective of Russia, we track a number of different threat actors that we associate with Russia. We're going to focus today primarily on Fancy Bear because that is, of course, related to the DNC breach, but also we released a report last week or 2 weeks ago related to some interesting targeting we saw using Fancy Bear-related code within an Android application that was being used by a foreign military. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and take a kind of step back here, and we look at what are the elements of the Russian intelligence services. So obviously, they all report back up to the leader of the country, and within his control are a number of different elements. The ones that are most interesting from a cyber perspective are the SVR, the GRU, and the FSB. In terms of what these organizations are, the SVR is closer to CIA or MI6 perhaps. They're generally focused on political intelligence, diplomatic intelligence, and outbound facing. So they focus on things outside of Russia and the Russian sphere of influence. The FSB is closer to MI5. They've got personnel that are focused on internal issues within Russia and then in what they consider the near abroad or the Commonwealth of Independent States. And then the third element is the GRU, which is military intelligence. And the military intelligence doesn't report directly to Vladimir Putin. It actually goes through the Minister of Defense. But that's effectively the structures that we look at when we start trying to figure out, as we see targeting, as we see activity, where might these organizations report to? What are their directives? What are their mission statements? And what's driving this activity that we're tracking? As it were last week, there was a number of events that occurred. The U.S. Department of Treasury began sanctioning the GRU itself, as well as Lieutenant General Korobov, and also the FSB as an organization. So sanctions have been levied against these organizations, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the GRU-related activity today. So when we think about where we look at the targeting, we think about where that targeting winds up from an actor perspective. There's a number of interests that we see the Russian intrusion operations that we track. I mentioned before there was about 8 or 9 different Russian intrusion actions that we track. And they all kind of tend to focus on various different interests. But if we put all of those interests onto one slide, their interests tend to be focused around political dissidents, troublemakers within Russia and the surrounding area, terrorism, counterterrorism, counterespionage, the near abroad, so issues related to Ukraine and to other countries in the near abroad, to Russia, the former Soviet bloc. NATO and Europe is a huge action that we see a lot of these actors going after in terms of targeting any NATO-related events, personnel, operations, etc. Elections are one that we've seen before, and I'm going to walk through what we call the Russian playbook when it comes to elections vis-a-vis Ukraine as kind of a nice wrap-up of the various things that they do. Energy and trade tends to be something that's pretty heavily targeted as well. We exposed an operation that we called Energetic Bear a number of years ago, and Energetic Bear was almost exclusively focused on energy-related businesses and organizations. There's been a lot going on with Russia and China. We actually see quite a bit of Chinese targeting of Russia today, but we also see it going the other way. So China is something where they just delivered new fighter jets to China, and there's, I think, a lot of concern from the Russians about what's going to happen in terms of the 5th generation fighter and how China develops their own fighters, perhaps based off of that technology. Ukraine has been an increasingly important issue, especially since 2014 and the events that occurred there. Syria and Turkey have been also emerging issues, and then sports, doping, and World Cup. All of these are issues that are a matter of national pride for the Russian Federation, and so that we actually do see targeting around those issues as well. So from a doctrinal standpoint, we look at, from a historical perspective, what types of things are going on within the adversary's sphere? What types of things can we see from within open source? And a good example of understanding the Russian capabilities and intentions is to look at some of the publications that have been produced over the last couple of years. And one that's particularly interesting, and I've actually blogged about in the past, is that there's a document that was published, an article published by General Valery Gerasimov, and he published it back in a few years ago. And within this documentation, I won't go through this article in depth, but he effectively kind of introduces this concept of hybrid warfare. And within hybrid warfare, kind of walks through how to affect regime change, how to have an outcome that's controlled through this concept of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare involves not just, putting tanks on the border and moving troops into a country, but how can you use information operations, cyber warfare, other kind of asymmetric elements to affect change or to create a situation that you'd like to create. So I've kind of taken this cyber Gerasimov model that I've put together here, which is really obtaining better outcomes through cyber activities. And so there's kind of a couple of things if you look at what's laid out in hybrid warfare and in the Gerasimov article in terms of what types of things you might conduct. So the first one is leveraging or incite dissident hackers within a target country to rise up against the norms of that country, or to make allegations that things are not as they should be or not as they actually are. And if there isn't an existing group, then you can make one up. So in the immediate actions in Ukraine after Euromaidan and the president fleeing to Russia, we see this group Cyber Berkut, which was named for a Ukrainian organization that had existed and was dissolved. We see the Cyber Berkut group emerge and start to conduct various operations that were against Ukrainian media and elections and people that might be problematic in that area. The other thing that we saw was DDoS attacks to disrupt infrastructure and cause panic, confusion, particularly within Ukraine. We've seen this from the Central Election Commission. We've seen get DDoSed by threat actors during election events, so on and so forth. And here you could see that there was some media around this, where there was businesses that were that there were DDoS attacks occurring around the elections, and a warning about this was issued within the media. Also, as Dimitri mentioned, hack the media and plant fake articles. The story here was pretty interesting in that there was, according to the SBU, Ukrainian intelligence, they'd stopped an attack against the Election Commission's website, which would have released that the fact that the right-wing candidate had actually won the election, and they had stopped that attack from occurring, but it was still published within the Russian media as if the attack had been successful, which is kind of an interesting exposure. Perhaps they were not informed that the operation had been stopped by the SBU and continued as if it had published as it was intended to. And then doxing of political targets. In this case, a mayoral candidate for Odessa was a 21-year-old former model, and she had been running pretty successfully in Odessa when this video was leaked of her parading around in her underwear, and she ultimately dropped out of the election, and the person that won for the mayor of Odessa was actually very pro-Russian. In fact, he was victim of a leak later, the Panama Papers, and in that release, it came out that he actually had a Russian passport and that there were some funds associated with him as well. So I guess these doxings work both ways, but certainly what better way to mitigate somebody as a threat in an electoral race than to leak embarrassing or sensitive information about them. And then using an army of trolls to build a base. And so, there's lots of articles about Russian trolls, and certainly if you use Twitter, I'm not an avid Twitterer, but there's certainly lots of indications that there's people that are pushing narratives and counter-narratives on Twitter that these accounts are, in many cases, automated. If you look at the user agent that they're using, you'll see that they're using bots or automated user agents in order to create these tweets that help kind of advance a narrative within that social media. And lastly, create confusion, fear, panic. So as Dimitri mentioned as well, the being able to put scary images on TVs in public places, and even shut off the power in December 2015, and purportedly again in December 2016. There were indications that the Ukrainian power was disrupted through cyber operations, not tied to Fancy Bear or to Cozy Bear in this case, but another bear that we actually track. And that is certainly one way to create confusion and panic right before Christmas when it's nice and cold to turn off the power. So we'll talk about kind of the application of this in another sphere as well. For those of you out there maybe recognize this picture, this is a Su-24 Fencer being shot down over Turkey or Syria, depending on who you ask. Pilot ejected and was killed by ground fire. And I put this up there, big Archer fan, but if you want Sophacy, which is one of the names for the X-agent implant used by the Fancy Bear actor, that's a pretty good way to get targeted by these guys. So almost immediately after this occurs, a whole series of cyber events start to unfold, and ultimately leading to some direct intrusion operations. So in November 2015, Turkish F-16 shoots down this Russian Su-24, and 3 days later we start to see the first DDoS attacks against Turkey by various actors. A few weeks later, we start to see that there's more coordinated operations. The FSB raids Turkish banks on the suspicion of money laundering. At the same time, we see DDoS attacks against Turkish banks and Turkish DNS infrastructure. By January 2016, we start to see, this actually goes both ways, we start to see DDoS attacks against the Ministry of Transportation, the Russian postal system, the FSB itself, and the Central Bank of Russia. This very much appears to be a tit for tat where the perceived Russian DDoS attacks against Turkey result in retaliatory DDoS attacks. By March, we start to see an actor that we track as Berserk Bear targeting European energy companies. We see the Turkish Central Population Management System, MIRNIS, was breached, and a data leak of some 50 million records occurs. The messaging around that from a purported hacktivist group, or what we would call a faketivist group now, was suspicious at best. It was a group that had never really been heard of before and hasn't been heard of since, which is very typical when you see a fake hacktivist group show up as a cover for leaking information. In May 2016, multiple hospitals in Turkey's provinces were affected by a cyber attack, with questionable attribution claims, faketivist-style claims. We see Berserk Bear start targeting additional organizations within Turkey almost immediately after that in July. And then we see ultimately a coup attempt against the president of Turkey. And after that, things kind of ramp back down and relations effectively normalized. So let's talk about Fancy Bear specifically here. Fancy Bear targeting generally is looking at geopolitical targets of interest to Russia. We've seen them target NATO very heavily. We see them go after various military and defense technology companies. They've gone after the media in the past, and they're pretty consistent with who they target. It's almost always something that is of strategic or other interest to the Russian Federation. From their tactics, techniques, and procedures, we've seen them drop multiple 0 days, which is generally a pretty good indication of a very capable organization. Having the ability to drop, in this case, this is a Adobe 0 day that they deployed. That's something that signifies that they've got a lot of resources and they have the ability to source or create these 0 days and then use them effectively. When they've been using them, they use a number of different tools that are generally pretty unique to these groups, to Fancy Bear. So we've seen them use a number of different downloaders, such as Downrage and others that are how they kind of deploy their second stage tool. Their second stage implant, typically X-Agent, and we've seen them use that very heavily across many different spheres. And the other thing that they're known for from a TTP perspective is phishing that use domains very similar to the target organization in an attempt to fish out credentials that they can then use to VPN in or come in as legitimate users or to collect email. And so some other names that they're known as, the security industry tends to, every company kind of likes to make up their own names. So we've got APT28 as a common name for them. We also hear them referred to as Sophacy, Zarateam, Sednit, and several others that are out there. So let's kind of go into the specifics of the announcement that the report that we released last week. So we put out a blog post called Danger Close, and this is kind of the case of Ukraine artillery targeting by Fancy Bear. So during routine hunting, we were looking for files that were interesting. We were looking for various things that might relate to, in this case, the Fancy Bear actor, just kind of one of our daily routines here. And we came across an APK file that referenced D30, and it appeared to contain some X-Agent remote access capabilities. So from there, we start analyzing the file itself, and I'll go into the actual analysis of the malware in a minute. But the analysis revealed that there was a legitimate file called D30. I'll let Dmitry jump in with the Russian if he wants to.
Well, Popper stands for Popravka, which is actually modification, is the translation of that. So it's sort of a re-release of the APK with a modification that has since been posted on Russian-speaking military forums.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to try to even butcher my Russian here. And so we see that this is mentioned on various Ukrainian file sharing forums. We've seen that it's been in various other forums that we were able to observe it in from around the December 2014, if not before, time frame, which lines up pretty.
December 2014 is when we noticed it, right? It may have, or when we saw indicators that it was posted there,
right.
But it may have appeared even before that.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The other thing is that we found this benign application or a legitimate application that was Poprovka D30. How'd I do?
Close enough.
Close enough. All right. No vodka for me. And assists with ballistic computations for the D30 122 millimeter howitzer. What we found from some of the open source analysis that we've done, this reportedly reduced the firing time of this weapon significantly, which is a pretty important and tactical capability to be able to have, being able to change the firing time from minutes to seconds.
So what happens is that this is a 1960s Soviet-era howitzer, so there's no computerization on it whatsoever. So if you have target coordinates, you literally have to figure out with a pen and paper,
yep.
Calculate the geo-coordinates, the elevation of the Earth, and everything else to figure out the settings for the howitzer. And with this application, you can plug it in and within a few seconds get the answers for the settings.
Yeah, I think it actually came with a slide rule on a table. So this is a very manual process, and certainly under fire, hard to compute. And the D30 application we identified was being used by Ukrainian government forces during the same time frame that the app was in circulation. What this means is that we found a video that was featuring members of the 55th Artillery Brigade that were demonstrating the application, showing how it was used, and kind of walking through the amount of users that there were on that system. So getting into the bits and bytes, and I know a lot of people are very curious about this, so we'll spend some time here. Let's talk about the X-Agent capabilities. So the app requires an activation step that a Ukrainian national, Ukrainian individual, the individual that actually wrote the application needs to, you effectively have to ask them for the activation code, presumably provide some bona fides that you are Ukrainian artilleryman, and that you need access to the application. Once you demonstrate that you have that, presumably he provides that activation code, and you're able to go off and artillery things. The registration indicates that the app was likely intended only to be used by Ukrainian forces, which is certainly interesting to note.
And the reason probably is that D30 is widely used by many militaries, and he wanted to make sure it was used responsibly and only by his own forces.
Right. Well, it's a very common 1960s Soviet artillery piece. So you want to make sure that that app isn't being used against you. When you look at the permissions that the app requests, it requests access to read contacts, to read SMS data, to get account information, access to the internet, understand what the network state of the device is, check the Wi-Fi state, get details about the phone itself, change the network state, access the course location information, and the wake lock is for being able to trigger the malware to actually operate, and then read the call log.
So I see that there's no GPS permissions that are being requested by the app. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the access course location permission is really only to access the data that allows you to triangulate based off of cellular signal. The access find location permission would provide access to the GPS. I think that it's likely that they didn't do that for a number of reasons. One, asking for additional permissions, which might be outside of what the app was supposed to do or was advertised to do, would probably raise some alarms or at least some eyebrows.
And the original app did not use GPS and had no need for GPS, so if the malware that is bundled up inside the original app would ask for GPS all of a sudden, you could certainly have people asking what is going on and asking the author why he is requesting permission, which may trigger some investigations.
The other thing, too, is that GPS tends to eat up battery. So another way to kind of indicate that there might be something wrong or that the phone might be infected is to suck down the battery, very quickly. So by limiting the GPS information, you could effectively reduce that battery drain and maybe not tip off the user. And more to the point, the course location information is sufficient to find the general location where something is. There were indications based off of open source reporting and other things that we pulled that there were Russian ISR drones, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft in the area that would provide much more targeted information than probably even a consumer GPS would provide. So it effectively allow them to get the rough location, and then they can dial it in with the airborne.
So if you had the rough course location, you could send a drone over there to get the precise lock, and perhaps not even on just the D30, but identify the entire supporting units around the D30 that you can then target.
That's right, yeah. And there may have been other units that they would have been interested in around those artillery pieces. This is a table that we created with the supported commands with this particular X-Agent implant for Android. And you can see here there was a pretty comprehensive set of capabilities. So it allows you to pull the SMS history and the details. So you can actually read all of the SMS messages by pulling them out of the store on the phone. You could issue a command to conduct reconnaissance against the device to find out specifics about the what information it's providing to the cell tower. Even with traditional signals intelligence, this might also provide them more specific information that they could care about. Retrieve.
So if you had a Ukrainian artilleryman with this malware on his phone, they could have identified other connections of this person, other phone numbers that they could target through traditional signal intelligence interception capabilities.
Yeah, and even if you look at the 104, which is retrieve contact details, you can see other people that would be in the address book on that device. So that would certainly be useful for that perspective as well. See who they're calling and when to establish perhaps patterns of life or relationships. You can retrieve what other apps are installed. Perhaps you want to see other apps that you might use to, you might want to target with your Android implant. If you find that all of them have another app, perhaps that would be another viable target to implant with X-Agent moving forward. Retrieve the browser history, so that's really useful for understanding where they're going. And perhaps, the fancy bear actors have been known to use what we call strategic web compromise. So they know that people are visiting a site, and we can, then infect that site to try to infect the browser of the computer that they're using. So it's a very comprehensive capability. You could even exfiltrate files, list files on the device, and then exfiltrate them. This would be great for pictures or things like that if anybody was taking any sort of selfies, perhaps, or even intelligence reconnaissance-related pictures, and then to be able to retrieve that. And I should say that we don't believe that this implant was built specifically for this operation. I think that it's likely that they actually had this implant ready to go, and they may have used it in other cases that we're not
Because
aware
we have
of.
seen X-Agent implants certainly for Windows. We picked that up at the DNC.
Yep.
We've seen it for on Linux platforms. We've seen it even for iOS, but this was actually the first time we saw it on Android.
Yeah, we'll come back to that actually in a second. If you look side by side, there was a legitimate version of this app, and I think that it was published with all good intentions. And if you look on the left of the screen, you could actually see all of the class files that were used inside of the application. And then on the right is actually the compromised version, where they didn't remove any of those; they added their own, which really means that the same Android application was still there. You could still use it. It had all of the things that a user would expect, and they could request the access code from the author and be able to still activate the application. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. On the next slide, let's talk a little bit about cryptography. Can we talk about cryptography? So the X-Agent uses an RC4 key for the encryption of the command and control data.
And this is all variants of X-Agent, whether it's Windows or Linux or, in this case, Android.
Right. So in this case, I actually will provide two keys here. So the top key is a 50-byte key that's used within this Android implant for the RC4 encryption. On the bottom, you can see that there's an X-Agent from Linux. This is one that we retrieved from another location, and you can see that only 4 bytes differ. And so seeing that 46 out of 50 bytes are exactly the same in the same position is very much improbable overlap from two completely unrelated pieces of code. And to further support that, here's a comparison between the Windows version of X-Agent and the Android one that we found. And you can see that all of the strings that are used within that command and control protocol, this is not the only overlaps, this is just the one that looked really nice on a slide, but all of these fairly unique looking, in many cases, things like BTN capital G or AGS or OP RND, these things were exactly the same between the Windows version and the Android version. So between the cryptography, between the overlapping command and control protocol and some of the technical artifacts, becomes very much a strong relationship between the two. And then really connecting the dots, how does this tie back to Fancy Bear? So if we look at the C2 server, which is an IP address in the US, we've actually tied this to another Fancy Bear domain that was used to deploy their downrange implant against another target. So the domain that was used with downrange downloader to then deploy X-Agent ties back to this IP address, which was also tied to the Android version of the X-Agent implant.
So we now have, just to summarize it here, a C2 server that has been used for both an Android implant of X-Agent and another implant from Fancy Bear called Downrange for Windows. We have not seen that implant, the source code for that implant, anywhere released publicly.
No, and it's not an implant, though. Downrange is actually a downloader.
The downloader, right.
Yeah.
And we've seen it only exclusively associated with X-Agent, right?
That's right. You set them up, I'll knock them down. Lastly, the timeline here, let's just kind of go through. So the artifacts from the original, how do you pronounce it again? Poprovka D30 app began, we saw them between February 2013 and April of 2013 were the initial kind of dates that were in the legitimate version of the app. So sometime after that is presumably when a variant of the app that had the X-Agent implants embedded in it was released. Now, shortly after the app was released, the Euromaidan protests occurred 21 November 2013. By February 2014, the president flees Ukraine to go into Russia. About a week later, we see the annexation of Crimea. And by that spring, we're seeing pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine declare independence and start conflict. And as the spring rolls into summer, Ukrainian forces begin to try to retake the territory claimed by the separatists. In the course of this activity, the Malaysian aircraft is down. The MH17 gets shot down, presumably by a weapon that was fired out of eastern Ukraine. And some harsh fighting ensues, and by February 2015, a ceasefire becomes signed, which is continuously violated. And so really what's meant to be explained here is that at some point after this app was deployed, the situation in Ukraine deteriorates, and the implant was likely deployed and could continuously have been deployed up until pretty recently.
So Adam, this is great, but we actually had some questions come in since we published this report from a variety of different people. So let's try to address them here about this report. So first of all, the X-Agent source code, is it publicly available? Is it out in the wild?
No, it's not. We have not seen it in the wild, and I've seen people claiming that they've got copies of it and that that it is out there, and that is certainly probable that is the case. And the reason that we see that, it's very specific to the Linux variant of X-Agent. Typically, the threat actor Fancy Bear will actually deploy the source code of X-Agent for Linux when they're going to install it on a machine, because really
on a victim machine.
On a victim machine, because otherwise they would have so many static libraries that they would have to build in. It would increase the size of the implant, and it would make things a little bit messy. So what they're doing is they deploy the source code, they compile it locally, link it against the libraries on the system, and then remove the source code. In some cases, you can recover that source code via forensics analysis, and in other cases, it might have not properly deleted.
So in other words, if people do have the source code for X-Agent, they only have the Linux version, and it's probably only going to be the victim or the forensic firm working on behalf of the victim that could have possibly recovered it.
The only stuff that I've seen is the Linux source code.
And of course, the APK is written in Java.
Yeah, so you can actually recover the source effectively from that, though there were pieces of it that were obfuscated.
And then we talked about this already, but the APK did not use the GPS. It only used the course, the rough course location. And we talked about why that may be. They didn't want to ask for additional permissions. Most likely they didn't want the battery drain. And that was sufficient, probably enough, to send the drones over to identify the precise location of the units that they wanted to target.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we called it gross position data, which was kind of our nomenclature for this course position information. But yes, it doesn't use the GPS. It's using the cellular tower to generate a rough geolocation.
And then there were a lot of questions about the activation. So the original app, we talked about this, required you to call the developer and get an activation code. And the developer has actually claimed since our report that because of that, this malicious app could not be activated and thus could not be used by anyone. Is that true?
Well, I think that my response to that would be, does he have any way to validate that the application that the person was trying to register was the actual valid APK? And I think because of the distribution mechanism, it didn't go through, the Google Play Store or something like that, because it was distributed through forums and otherwise. As long as the control codes that were being submitted, which would be consistent because they didn't change the actual original application, as long as that was the case, then I don't think that individual would have any way to tell whether or not these activations were from an implanted version or modified version.
So this is actually a very important point, because the malware contained the original application, right? All the original source code. So the validation code was part of the malware. So if I'm using this infected application and I'm calling for the code, one, he doesn't know that I have the malicious application. Two, the code would actually work inside the malicious application because the code is being reused.
Yeah, said another way, the legitimate application was modified to include the malware. So it actually didn't change the functionality of that application.
Right. And then the other question that keeps coming up is, what evidence is there that this malicious application was actually used by Ukrainian military?
So this is, again, an intelligence assessment that we've made. We believe that it's likely that it was used because the application, the malicious version of the application was observed in military forums and in places where presumably personnel would be able to access it, right? It certainly would have been exposed to them without question. And so did anybody download it and install it? Our belief, again, is that or our assessment is that it's likely that that people would have been able to download it and had access to it.
Well, and I think the bigger issue is whether they did or not. The fact that someone went through all this effort and tried to compromise a specific application and try to get people to use it indicates a high level of interest of attempting to track those people. How successful it was, we're not experts on the military combat in eastern Ukraine. We're cybersecurity experts here, so we can't necessarily ascertain that. But we know that someone went through a hell of a lot of effort to try to compromise those people, and there are probably not that many organizations out there that would have an interest of targeting Ukrainian artillerymen in eastern Ukraine.
They had the capability, they had the intention, and it's pretty clear that an organization that would have that focus, that mission, would tie back to the GRU.
Right. And then lastly, this comes up sometimes too, is do we know if any howitzers were actually destroyed as a result of this APK or not?
Right, so we point to some publicly available information that suggests that there was
from the International Institute of Security Studies,
right.
IISS, that did the analysis of the inventory counts of various military equipments in Ukraine over the course of a number of years during the course of that conflict.
Right, and it appeared that there was a loss of, or a decline in D30 platforms that they had, so.
But we don't know, and I think we made it very clear, we don't know if that decline was a result of military action or if it's a result of those applications. I think the important point here is, again, to highlight the fact that someone was trying to target Ukrainian artillerymen. How successful they ultimately were is not to us to judge, but the fact that they were trying is a significant piece of evidence here as well. And I think in summary, if we were to assume that this was not Fancy Bear, that this was someone trying to be like Fancy Bear, they have to write, the Android version of the app, mimic the Windows version of the app for which there is no source code, have the same C2 infrastructure that's been used in other Fancy Bear operations, so they have to take it over and essentially reuse it and pretend to be Fancy Bear, and target Ukrainian artillerymen that very few would otherwise have an interest in.
And build the C2 server as well.
Exactly.
And use the same infrastructure that was then used for other Fancy Bear operations. And
use the nearly identical crypto key.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Well, that concludes the slide portion of our presentation. We had a lot of questions come in, so we'll try to address as many of them as we can. Just want to quickly mention that there will be another Crowdcast coming up on January 12th on cloud-enabled, the future of endpoint security. And if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A button below. And also, we'd love your feedback. So when this webinar finishes, please provide your feedback to us through the survey that you'll see at the end, and we'd love to take that into account. So I know we're out of time here, but let's go a little bit over and take some of the questions that people have submitted. So we have a question here. This is a question actually about the DHS report. So DHS, of course, put out a report last week on a variety of different Russian intrusion activities that some of them they've linked to DNC. But the question here is about the IOCs in that report, that they included legitimate IP addresses like Microsoft, Yahoo, and Azure. What was the information around these IP addresses? The U.S. asserted insinuated that they may be compromised assets in those domains. Were they? What's your take on that, Adam?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, I looked at, we reviewed a lot of those indicators, and there was a fair amount of Tor exit nodes and other domains that we weren't able to validate as being necessarily malicious at this time.
Got it. Let's see here. With regards to the slides, there's a lot of questions on slides and recording. So the recording with the slides will be posted later tonight, so please come back to our website for that. How do you know that the hacking against the DNC and other political organizations was done by Cozy and Fancy Bear, and what evidence do you have that they're linked to the Russian intelligence services? Let's quickly address that.
So I would point to your blog from June of this year, which kind of laid out a lot of the technical indicators related to that. The Cozy Bear attack against the DNC occurred in July 2015. It was part of one of their broader campaigns. They tend to cast a very wide net, and they swooped up some DNC during that initial campaign. And then subsequently, the use of X-Agent and the infrastructure that was involved in the DNC attack was, from a Fancy Bear perspective, was stuff that we had been tracking. So, in fact, when the CrowdStrike services team hit the ground and when they deployed Falcon Host, it almost immediately lit up as being associated with Fancy Bear.
Yeah. So another question about the DHS report. They published YARA rule for a common PHP web shell, common tool that's used by a lot of hackers. What's your take on that one?
I mean, yeah. If you could use something that's already out in the public domain, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I've looked at that web shell. It's actually a pretty comprehensive web shell. And further, it gives them a little bit of deniability or ability to hide in the fact that it is something that's public and more broadly used. So certainly, I think that any time you find that web shell, it would be bad news. So it would be certainly well within your best interest to use the DHS material there. And if you do identify any of that web shell, certainly feel free to reach out to us. We'll happily take a look or contact your friendly incident response team.
So another question, other than the IP address we talked about in the Android malware, were there any other similarities in C2 tradecraft or unique encryption in the C2 that ties the Android X agent to the previous Fancy Bear activity?
Yeah, so there was 46 of 50 bytes were identical with an X agent Linux implant that we've looked at that was deployed in a pretty sensitive environment. And also the command and control protocol and the strings that I highlighted in those slides were all, again, tied to previous Fancy Bear malware and indicators.
Question, how hard is it to reverse engineer X-Agent and then rebuild it in the way that comes close to the original version?
It would be pretty difficult. X-Agent is a very complex structure. It's effectively a microkernel that has many different plugins and modules. Just looking at the layout of we've recovered pieces of the source tree and so on. It's pretty extensive. So I think to do it in a way that's convincing and compelling would be a pretty significant effort.
Besides government, military, political, and policy organizations, what others, including industry verticals, should be concerned about targeting by Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear?
So I think anybody that's doing business within Russia should be aware of these things and should be looking for it. Energy tends to be one where we've seen some targeting in the past, and you never know where they're going to start targeting you. I think for example, the WADA and the various anti-doping agency targeting, they probably wouldn't have perceived themselves to be a huge target of Russian cyber intrusion operations until they started, exposing Russian athletes for alleged doping, and that certainly put the crosshair right on them. So, in many of these cases, intelligence is about understanding what's going on in the space and applying that to your local or your own organization, and then use that information to constantly track what the threat landscape looks like for you and how that changes.
So what code evidence was found at the DNC? I assume it wasn't X-Agent. We actually published, as Adam mentioned, a blog post on this on June 4th, Bears in the Midst. So take a look at that. We list a variety of different implants that were used by both Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. X-Agent was one of those implants, not the Android, but the Windows version of X-Agent, as well as some others. Have you seen Fancy Bear or any other threat actors hijack other mobile apps in the same way? Maybe other threat actors like China, Iran, and maybe even ISIL?
Yeah, we have. We certainly with China during the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, we observed them target both Android and iOS applications. We've seen many other threat actors have developed at least a nascent capability for mobile. One of the challenges that they face on mobile is that almost in most of these cases, it either needs to be something that comes out of an unauthorized app store or on a jailbroken device. The Umbrella Revolution activity was pretty interesting because they were actually propagating over the peer-to-peer communication protocols that they were using during the Umbrella Revolution. The cell towers were shut off, and they were using Bluetooth-enabled devices to kind of peer-to-peer message each other. and it looks like that's how that was distributed.
All right, let's take a couple more questions before we finish up here. But in cases where the government has called out Russia, what type of blowback was observed, if any? Tearing down of infrastructure, different TTPs. Well, the government just recently, for the first time, called out the Russians, but we've actually called out an actor that we called Energetic Bear a while back, and we've seen some pretty significant impact to their operations. Why don't you discuss that?
Yeah, so when Energetic Bear, we released that in the 2014 Global Threat Report. We're actually going to be releasing our 2016 Global Threat Report in a few weeks here, so definitely stay tuned for that. We'll introduce some new actors again, but in that one we introduced Energetic Bear for the first time, and that ultimately led to a lot of exposure to Energetic Bear. Numerous security companies subsequently blogged about it or published reports about it, and as a result, they effectively shut down most of their operations using their existing infrastructure. We've continued to see both Cozy and Fancy today. Whether the continued pressure causes them to abate at some point, we'll see.
All right, last question here. Taking into account the elections that are coming up this year in France and Germany, have you been aware of specific targeting by Fancy Bear on these two countries recently? So the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of activity all over Europe, actually, particularly in countries where there are significant elections coming up and where the Russians have strategic interests. And certainly political parties and government agencies in those countries should be taking notice and starting to look at potential intrusions that they may have already experienced from those two actors.
And we will be covering that also in the 2016 Global Threat Report, which should be out in early February.
Perfect. And on that last plug, thank you all so much for attending. We really appreciate your time. The recording will be posted later tonight, and have a great day.
Thank you.